When a man decides to leave his wife of 12 years, he does not do it all at once. He does it in the silent margins of the morning, in the way he leaves his wedding ring on the dresser just to wash his hands, and in the quiet redirection of their joint bank accounts. At 37, Nora Cross was the quiet anchor of her family. She kept the immaculate Craftsman home, ironed Dane's linen shirts, and cataloged every receipt for his civil engineering firm. When Dane packed his leather duffel and walked out, leaving her with a dwindling bank account and their 11-year-old son Leo, the neighborhood whispered with pity. They saw Nora as a discarded homemaker, fragile and broken. They did not know that for years, Nora's training as an archivist had led her to quietly preserve a devastating paper trail of every lie, every hidden transaction, and every betrayal Dane thought he had buried. To watch how a quiet woman turns years of silent endurance into a methodical blueprint for survival, please subscribe, like, and leave a comment below. I need to know what happened. What happens when the person you threw away is the only one who holds the key to everything you have left to lose? The spin cycle of our washing machine had a low, off-balance shudder that rattled the pipes behind the drywall. It was a sound I had meant to ask Dane to look at for 6 months, but now, in the quiet of a Tuesday morning, it was the only voice in the house. I stood in the laundry room, folding a stack of Dane's old, slightly frayed Oxford shirts, the ones he had deemed too worn to pack for his new executive apartment downtown. My hands moved with a slow, practiced rhythm. At 37, you are old enough to know that nothing is truly permanent, yet young enough to feel the sting of being replaced like an outdated piece of office equipment. I carried the folded shirts to the hallway closet. The house smelled faintly of his sandalwood cologne and the damp, cold air leaking through the old wooden window frames. The kitchen island was piled with mail. I sorted through it with a paring knife, my fingers cool against the envelopes. Among the utility bills and grocery circulars was our monthly joint credit card statement. I opened it, my eyes immediately skipping past the grocery charges and gas station fill-ups to a charge from 6 months ago, a 3-night stay at the Bellevue Plaza Hotel in Seattle. The charge was listed under Business Conference Lodging. But I remembered that weekend. Dane had told me he was at a land surveying seminar in Boise, sleeping in a budget motel to save the firm some overhead. I didn't let my breathing change. I took a small yellow highlighter from the kitchen drawer, ran a transparent streak of yellow across the Bellevue Plaza line item, and placed the statement into a green manila folder labeled Firm Discrepancies. At 2 o'clock, the front door chimed. I opened it to find my mother-in-law, Georgia Cross, standing on the porch. She was 65, wearing a cream boucle coat that looked far too expensive for the damp, drizzling autumn weather. In her hands, she held a cardboard bakery box from the high-end pastry shop near Dane's new high-rise. "Nora, dear," Georgia said, her voice dropping into that soft, hushed tone people use when they are visiting a convalescent home. She stepped past me without waiting for an invitation, her leather gloves smelling of rain and lavender. "I was just in the neighborhood for my bridge group. I brought some almond croissants for you and Leo." "Thank you, Georgia," I said, closing the door. "That's very kind." Georgia walked into the living room, her eyes instantly scanning the space with the clinical efficiency of an estate appraiser. She noticed the thermostat setting, 64 degrees, and the lack of fresh flowers on the entry table. She set the bakery box on the kitchen island and turned to me, her face rearranging itself into an expression of deep, performative sorrow. "It feels so chilly in here, Nora," she murmured, rubbing her gloved hands together. "Dane always did say you were a bit thrifty with the utilities, but I suppose now you have to be." "The house stays warm enough once the sun comes up," I replied, keeping my hands resting quietly in the pockets of my cardigan. "Of course," Georgia sighed, patting my arm with a heavy, diamond-encrusted hand. We are all just so devastated by this situation, Nora. Truly. But you must be practical. Dane is under immense pressure with the firm's expansion right now, and carrying the mortgage on this big craftsman house while paying rent on his city apartment, well, it's a heavy burden for a man to bear alone. The needle was small, but it sank deep. She wanted me to know that the house, the home where I had spent 12 years painting the walls, planting the garden, and raising her grandson, was now considered a financial drain on her son. "Have you looked at those new garden apartments on Elm Street?" Georgia continued, her tone dripping with helpful, polite poison. "They're very efficient, much easier for a single mother to maintain. It would really lighten Dane's load if we could get this house on the market before winter." "I'll keep that in mind, Georgia," I said, offering her a calm, compliant smile. The psychological truth of Georgia's visit was simple. She didn't hate me. She simply needed me to disappear quietly. If I moved into a small, invisible apartment and accepted a minimal settlement, Dane's betrayal would be wiped clean. He wouldn't be the man who abandoned his devoted wife. He would simply be a successful businessman who had outgrown an old life. After Georgia left, Leo came home from middle school. He was 11, carrying his father's quiet, stubborn jawline and a defensive, guarded posture that had grown heavier over the last 2 weeks. He ignored the almond croissants on the counter, heading straight for the cabinet to grab an energy bar. "Your grandmother stopped by," I said, leaning against the counter. "She brought pastries." "I'm not hungry," Leo muttered, his eyes fixed on his school tablet. "Dad texted me. He said he's taking me to the private box at the stadium this Saturday. He said Sylvia Ross is going to show me her firm's digital drafting program." Sylvia Ross was the urban developer Dane had been partnering with for the past 18 months. She was 34, sharp, and possessed a level of corporate influence that Dane had spent his entire life chasing. "That sounds educational, Leo," I said, my voice steady, betraying none of the cold, hollow ache in my chest. "Yeah, whatever," Leo said, walking toward the stairs. "Dad says Sylvia's company is going to sponsor my tech camp next summer. He said you probably couldn't manage the registration fee this year anyway." He went up the stairs, his bedroom door closing with a soft, final click. I stood in the kitchen as the afternoon light faded into a cold, slate gray. My husband was already using his new partner's wealth to buy our son's future, presenting himself as the provider of opportunities while leaving me to play the role of the impoverished, restrictive mother. I walked down the hallway to my study, locked the door, and turned on the small desk lamp. I pulled the green folder from my drawer. I was an archivist. For a decade, I had digitized the historical records of our city's oldest families. I knew how to look at a document not just for what it said, but for what it attempted to hide. I pulled up Dane's firm's public bankruptcy filings from last winter. The firm had supposedly lost its entire liquid reserve on a failed development project called Pine Ridge. Because of that loss, Dane had claimed we had to freeze our personal accounts and delay our mortgage restructuring. But as I looked at the surveyor's receipts from that project, I noticed a tiny recurring billing code. PR-09-SR. I cross-referenced that code with a private consulting ledger I had copied from Dane's old home office hard drive. The code belonged to a private personal account registered under Dane's name in Delaware, an account that had received 3 separate deposits of $50,000 during the exact month the Pine Ridge project had supposedly collapsed. The source of those deposits? Ross Urban Developments. My husband hadn't lost our savings in a bad project. He had been paid to let it fail. I leaned back in my chair, the green light of the screen reflecting in the dark window pane. The first thread of their golden empire was in my fingers. I just had to decide when to pull. Oak and Vine Grocers had always smelled of freshly ground espresso and artisanal cheese. For 12 years, it was where I had shopped every Thursday afternoon, exchanging polite gossip with the cheesemonger and buying the organic rosemary chicken that Dane liked for our Sunday dinners. On this particular Thursday, I stood at the register, my handbasket containing a single roasting chicken, a bundle of carrots, and a small jar of imported honey for Leo's tea. Tricia, the cashier who had watched Leo grow from a toddler in a cart to a quiet middle schooler, offered me a warm, careful smile as she scanned the honey. "That'll be $34.12, Nora." I slid our joint debit card through the terminal. A sharp digital beep echoed in the small space. The screen flashed. Transaction declined. "Oh," Tricia said, her smile faltering, her eyes darting quickly to the customer waiting behind me. "Let's try it again. Sometimes the chip reader is a little sensitive." I slid it again. The terminal beeped, identical and unforgiving. Declined. My face remained perfectly calm, though a quiet, suffocating heat began to rise in the back of my neck. I reached into my handbag, pulled out the debit card from my personal freelance account, the account that held the meager earnings from my occasional document digitizing projects, and handed it to her. "Let's use this one, please," I said, "and we can put the honey back." "Of course, dear," Tricia murmured, her voice dropping into that hushed, patronizing register of pity. As I walked out of the store carrying my single, light plastic bag, I felt the eyes of the neighborhood on my back. In our small, affluent suburb, a declined credit card at the local gourmet grocer was the social equivalent of a scarlet letter. It was the first public confirmation that the rumors were true. Dane Cross had moved on, and Nora was being slowly, systematically starved out. I sat in my Volvo, the engine idling, and pulled out my phone. I dialed Dane's number. He answered on the fourth ring. In the background, I could hear the muted hum of city traffic and the distinct upscale clatter of a restaurant patio. "Nora," Dane said, his voice low, professional, and thoroughly irritated. "I'm in the middle of a lunch meeting with Sylvia and the zoning board. Is this urgent?" "The joint card was declined at Oak and Vine, Dane," I said, keeping my tone perfectly level. A heavy, impatient sigh came through the receiver. "We had to adjust the daily limits, Nora. Sylvia's accounting team is running a forensic scan on all joint accounts to prepare the financial disclosures for our lawyers. It's just standard procedure during a split. We need to streamline the household outflows." The psychological sting was clinical. Sylvia Ross's corporate accountants were sitting in a high-rise office downtown, auditing my grocery purchases, deciding how much my son and I were allowed to eat. "Leo needs groceries, Dane," I said softly. "Then go to the discount market on the bypass," he shot back, his polite facade slipping for a fraction of a second into sheer condescension. "Let's not make a tragedy out of this, Nora. Millions of people shop there. You need to adjust your expectations. I have to go." The call disconnected with a dry click. I didn't call him back. I drove home, parked the car, and carried the single chicken into the kitchen. The psychological insight was clear. Dane wasn't trying to save money. He was trying to humiliate me. He wanted to make my life so small, so uncomfortable, and so socially embarrassing that I would sign whatever meager divorce agreement his lawyers threw at me just to make the shame stop. That night, after Leo had gone to bed with his laptop, I sat in my study. The house was cold, the silence heavy. I booted up my laptop, opened my encrypted archiving program, and began to dig deeper into the Delaware shell company, Stonecrest Holdings. Using the bank routing numbers I had extracted from Dane's old home office drive, I traced a wire transfer of $170,000 that had occurred on April 12th. The funds had been sent to an escrow account in Seattle. I spent 2 hours searching the Seattle property registry until I found the destination. A luxury loft condominium in the Pearl District, purchased for $850,000. The deed was registered under the name of Sylvia Ross, but the down payment, the $170,000, had been paid entirely by Stonecrest Holdings. My husband had used the money from our joint marital estate, disguised as a Pine Ridge project loss, to purchase a luxury love nest for his mistress. They had been sleeping under a roof paid for by my family's stolen savings while I was home, patch painting our craftsmen and turning down the heat to save on the electric bill. But as I scrolled to the very bottom of the Stonecrest Bank registration document, my fingers froze on the keyboard. There was a guarantor listed on the Delaware filing, a corporate trust designed to shield the identity of the primary investor. The trust was called the GC Legacy Trust. I knew that name. My mother-in-law, Georgia Cross, was the sole trustee. Georgia hadn't just been bringing me bakery croissants out of pity. She was actively financing the shell company her son was using to hide our marital assets. The entire family had colluded to erase me, and they had used my own silence as their primary weapon. I closed my laptop, the screen's light fading from the dark walls of my study. I took a slow sip of my cold tea. The trap was much larger than I had realized, but they had forgotten one fundamental truth. An archivist does not just collect documents. An archivist knows how to read the patterns, and the pattern they had left behind was about to lead them straight into a courtroom they couldn't buy. The hum of a luxury engine was a low, vibration-like sound that felt out of place in our quiet neighborhood. On Saturday morning at precisely 10 o'clock, a sleek, charcoal-gray Audi e-tron pulled up to the curb. It didn't park. It sat idling, its headlights cutting through the damp morning mist like two cold, searching eyes. Dane didn't get out to knock. He simply tapped the horn, a short, polite double chirp that spoke of absolute impatience. "He's here," Leo said, his voice instantly rising with a frantic, eager energy. He had been sitting by the front window for an hour, his new tech jacket already zipped to his chin. He grabbed his duffel bag, not looking at me. "Wait a moment, Leo," I said, my voice gentle but firm as I stepped toward the front door. "Let me speak to your father first." I walked down the concrete porch steps. The air was biting, smelling of wet earth and decaying leaves. Dane finally stepped out of the driver's seat. He looked immaculate, wearing a new tailored wool coat and designer sunglasses that shielded his eyes from the gray sky. He looked like a man who had already shed the skin of his suburban life. "Nora," he said, offering a stiff, practiced nod. He didn't step onto our walkway. He stood by the open car door, keeping a deliberate physical distance between us. "Leo ready? We have a lunch reservation at the Stadium Club before the kickoff." "He's ready," I said, stopping at the edge of the grass. "But we need to discuss the household budget, Dane. The $500 cap on the joint account is not enough to cover Leo's tutoring and the utility bill." Dane's jaw tightened, a brief flash of irritation crossing his face before he smoothed it over with a patronizing smile. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a plain white envelope, sliding it across the roof of the car toward me. "I figured you'd make a scene," he said, his voice low and carefully modulated so it wouldn't carry to the neighbors' houses. "There's $500 cash in there. It should cover the essentials for the next 2 weeks. But let's be honest, Nora, this is on you. If you would just sign the preliminary separation agreement Robert Sterling sent over, we could release a lump sum from the equity. You're only hurting yourself, and Leo, by stalling." The psychological reality of his words was clear. He was holding our child's stability hostage, using child support as a negotiating tool to force my signature on a document that would strip me of my rights to his firm. Before I could answer, the front door slammed. Leo ran down the steps, his face glowing as he saw the sleek car. "Hey, Dad!" Leo cried, throwing his duffel into the back seat. He barely glanced at me, his eyes locked on the leather interior of the Audi. "Is this the new car? It's so cool!" "It's a hybrid, buddy. I'll show you the digital dash on the way," Dane said, his voice instantly shifting into that warm, indulgent fatherly tone that felt entirely foreign to me now. He patted Leo on the shoulder, then gave me a final, cold look over his sunglasses. "We'll be back Sunday evening. Don't wait up." I stood on the driveway as the silent electric car glided away, leaving nothing but the faint scent of leather and rain behind. I was 37, standing alone in front of a house that was slowly freezing, holding an envelope of cash like a dismissed servant. My son was riding in a luxury car, completely captivated by the shiny, guilt-free world his father was building with Sylvia Ross. I walked back inside, the silence of the empty rooms pressing against my ears. I went straight to my study, locked the door, and opened the green folder. I pulled up the digital copy of the GC Legacy Trust, the trust controlled by my mother-in-law, Georgia. I spent 3 hours cross-referencing the trust's original funding documents from 8 years ago, when Dane's father had passed away. According to the court's probate records, 10% of the estate's residual value, approximately $90,000, had been legally willed directly to Leo, to be held in a custodial account under my co-trusteeship until his 18th birthday. But I had never seen that money. I had never signed a single custodial document. I navigated deeper into the Delaware corporate archives, searching for the banking signature cards associated with the GC Legacy Trust's custodial accounts. When the digital image of the signature card loaded onto my screen, my breath caught in my throat. There, on the line marked Co-Trustee Signature, was my name, Nora Cross. But the handwriting was stiff, the slant too vertical, the loop of the O completely flat. It was a forgery. Dane and Georgia hadn't just begun hiding money when the marriage fell apart. 8 years ago, while I was cradling a toddler and mourning the loss of my father-in-law, my husband and his mother had forged my name on a legal trust release, secretly diverting our son's inheritance into Georgia's private fund. And that fund, as I had discovered the night before, had been used to pay the escrow deposit on Sylvia Ross's luxury condo. They had stolen from their own child to finance Dane's corporate lifestyle and his future with his mistress. I stared at the forged signature on the glowing monitor. My fingers were cold, but my heart was beating in a steady, lethal rhythm. They believed my quiet nature was a sign of blindness. They believed that because I had never asked questions during our marriage, I would never find the answers after it ended. They had no idea that the paper trail they had created was about to become the very cage that would lock them in. The chill in the morning was not a sudden shock, but a slow, creeping weight that settled into my bones before I even opened my eyes. I pulled the heavy wool blanket tighter around my shoulders and breathed out. A faint, translucent puff of white mist appeared in the dim light of the bedroom. The thermostat on the wall read 58 degrees. I walked down to the basement, my slippers clicking on the cold wooden stairs, and stood before the old cast-iron furnace. It was clicking, a hollow metallic sound, but the pilot light remained dark. I went back up to the kitchen and dialed Mark, the local HVAC technician who had serviced our Craftsman house for 10 years. He was a quiet, hard-working man whose children went to the same middle school as Leo. "Mark," I said, rubbing my hands together to warm them, It's Nora Cross. The furnace isn't igniting. I think the thermocouple might be shot again. A long, heavy silence came through the receiver. I could hear the background noise of his truck engine idling, the turn signal clicking. "Nora," Mark said, his voice tight and painfully awkward. "Look, I'm sorry. Dane called our office last Thursday. He removed your address from the Cross and Finch corporate account and canceled the annual residential maintenance contract. He told us that any future service calls for that address had to be billed directly to you." "I see," I said softly. "Because the corporate account is flagged, our system requires a flat $400 emergency dispatch fee for residential calls, paid up front," Mark murmured, his tone laced with genuine embarrassment. "I wish I could do something, Nora, but the office manager, she has to follow the system." "I understand, Mark," I said, keeping my voice calm and polite. "I'll have to look at my budget and call you back. Thank you anyway." I hung up. The physical neglect of the house was now visible, structured by Dane's systematic withdrawal of resources. He had built his firm's reputation on reliability and structure, yet he was quietly letting his own family's roof freeze. At 6 o'clock on Sunday evening, the charcoal gray Audi pulled up to the curb. Leo stepped out, carrying a large, glossy black box under his arm. Dane didn't get out of the car. He didn't even turn off the headlights. He simply waited until Leo reached the porch before accelerating away, the silent electric engine humming in the dark. Leo walked into the kitchen, his face flushed, wearing a brand-new, expensive designer ski jacket. "Look what Dad got me," he said, setting the glossy box on the counter. It was a high-end virtual reality headset, the kind that cost nearly $1,000. "He said I can use it to play the new space simulator." "It's very advanced, Leo," I said, wrapped in my mother's old knit blanket. "How was your weekend?" "It was cool," he said, his voice shifting into that distant, scripted tone he used whenever he felt guilty. "We had dinner at Sylvia's house last night. She is a chef who made these tiny pizzas." He looked around the cold kitchen, his eyes landing on the space heater I had set up near the table. "Why is it so cold in here?" "The furnace is acting up," I said. "I've put a heater in your room and we have plenty of blankets." Leo shrugged, his expression turning sullen. "Dad's apartment has heated floors. Sylvia's house has a private theater. Why do we have to live in this stupid old house anyway? Dad says you're just keeping it to be difficult." The needle went in, cold and precise. Dane was successfully translating my poverty, a poverty he had manufactured, into a personal failure in our son's eyes. "Georgia and Sylvia said I should apply to St. Jude's Academy for next year," Leo added, his fingers tracing the plastic wrapping of his new headset. "Sylvia's on the board of trustees. She said she can get me in, and Dad's going to pay the tuition. They're already planning my schedule." The exclusion was complete. They were deciding my son's academic future, utilizing Sylvia's social capital, and rewriting the hierarchy of his life without ever uttering my name. "That's a very prestigious school, Leo," I said, offering him a quiet, unbothered smile. "Go on up and test your new headset. I'll bring up some soup." After he went upstairs, I locked myself in my study. The small space heater hummed on the floor, casting a pale orange glow against the dark mahogany shelves. I opened my laptop and pulled up the home equity line of credit, HELOC, on our Craftsman house. 6 months ago, Dane had withdrawn $50,000 from the equity. He had told me it was a short-term bridge loan to help Cross and Finch Associates cover payroll during a temporary contract delay with the city. I traced the bank routing number for that withdrawal. It hadn't gone to the firm's payroll account. It had been deposited directly into the endowment fund of St. Jude's Academy as a corporate capital campaign donation. I pulled up St. Jude's annual donor report from my digital archives. There, listed under the Platinum Benefactor tier, were two names side by side, Dane Cross and Sylvia Ross. He had taken the equity out of the house my own father had helped us buy, the house I held a 50% legal stake in, to buy a seat next to his mistress on the board of an elite private school. But the most devastating detail was on the digital signature certificate for the HELOC withdrawal page. The digital signature of Nora Cross had been verified through a private email address I had never seen before. nora.cross.stonecrest@gmail.com. My husband had created a fake digital identity in my name, used it to forge my consent on an equity withdrawal, and stolen $50,000 from our home to buy his way into his mistress's high society circle. I sat in the cold study, the space heater clicking in the dark. My breath came in slow, measured patterns. They thought they were playing a game of attrition, waiting for me to freeze, waiting for me to break. They had no idea that every dollar they stole, every document they forged, and every silent exclusion they designed was being meticulously cataloged in a digital vault they couldn't touch. The dry, brittle leaves scraped against the concrete of the driveway, a scraping, rhythmic sound that filled the cold morning air. I was raking alone, my hands stiff and red inside my old gardening gloves. The physical labor of maintaining our half-acre property was becoming a daily chore, a visible sign of Dane's absence that the neighbors could watch from behind their kitchen curtains. A pristine white Volvo SUV slowed down as it approached our house, its tires crunching on the fallen acorns. The passenger window rolled down. Maddie Finch leaned over the leather seat, her face arranged in an expression of intense, practiced sympathy. Maddie was the wife of Arthur Finch, Dane's business partner, and the unofficial social matriarch of our neighborhood association. "Nora, dear," Maddie said, her voice dropping into that hushed hospital visitor register. "I saw you raking and just had to stop. You look so industrious." "Hello, Maddie," I said, leaning on my rake, keeping my posture relaxed and pleasant. "I wanted to speak to you about the Autumn Harvest Gala next weekend," Maddie murmured, her eyes darting to my worn cardigan before returning to my face. "We didn't send you an invitation this year, Nora. We thought about it long and hard, but we figured it would be so incredibly uncomfortable for you. Dane is bringing Sylvia Ross, you see. It's their first public appearance as a couple and, well, we didn't want you to feel trapped in the spotlight." The social quarantine was now official, delivered with a polite, neighborly smile. "I appreciate your thoughtfulness, Maddie," I said, offering her a calm, entirely unbothered smile. "You're right, I do prefer the quiet right now." Maddie blinked, a flicker of disappointment crossing her eyes. She had expected tears, or perhaps a defensive outburst she could report back to Georgia. "Well, you're so strong, Nora. Truly. If you need help with the leaves, let us know. Though I suppose you'll be moving soon anyway." The window rolled up, and the white SUV glided away, leaving me alone in the freezing yard. The psychological truth of her visit was clear. In our social circle, status was a borrowed commodity. The moment Dane left, my citizenship in this neighborhood was revoked. They didn't treat me like an enemy. They treated me like a ghost, an uncomfortable reminder of how easily any of them could be erased and replaced. The next afternoon, I sat in the counselor's office at Oak Creek Middle School. The room smelled of old paper and industrial floor wax, the fluorescent lights humming overhead. Mrs. Alcott, Leo's academic advisor, sat across the desk, looking through a folder with a troubled, hesitant expression. "Nora," Mrs. Alcott said, her voice quiet, "I wanted to discuss the transcript transfer requests we received yesterday. St. Jude's Academy has requested Leo's full academic and disciplinary records for the spring semester. I see, I said. Mrs. Alcott slid a document across the desk toward me. The request was signed by Dane, of course, but there's a second form, a tuition and sponsorship guarantee. It's signed by Sylvia Ross, acting as Leo's family representative. I was a bit confused because our system still lists you as Leo's primary guardian, and we haven't received your co-signature on the transcript release. I looked at the form. Sylvia's signature was bold, written in a sharp, expensive black ink. She was already claiming my son on paper, establishing herself as his benefactor while the school quietly normalized my erasure because of her financial leverage. The school district's policy is usually to require both parental signatures for a private school transfer, Mrs. Alcott murmured, her eyes holding a touch of genuine pity. But because St. Jude's is a private institution and Sylvia's Family Foundation is a major donor to our district's arts program, the administration is inclined to expedite the transfer, if Dane insists. The system was moving around me, greased by Sylvia's money and Dane's corporate influence. I understand the pressure you're under, Mrs. Alcott, I said, offering her a gentle, reassuring smile. Please let the administration know that I will review the transfer files and handle this directly with Dane's lawyers. Thank you, Nora, she said, looking visibly relieved that I hadn't made a scene. I drove home, the gray sky turning into a dark, freezing night. At 10 o'clock, after Leo had gone to bed with his space simulator, I sat in my study. The small space heater clicked on the floor, its orange glow reflecting in my glasses. I opened my archiving portal and began to dig into the municipal bidding history of Cross and Finch Associates. I wanted to know exactly how Dane's firm was surviving the Pine Ridge project collapse that had supposedly wiped out our marital savings. I traced the city's bidding records for the new public water treatment facility, a multi-million-dollar municipal contract that had been awarded to Ross Urban Developments last summer. Cross and Finch Associates had submitted a bid for the land surveying and engineering portion of that project, but their bid was exactly 20% higher than the city's estimated budget, ensuring they lost the prime contract. But immediately after Ross Urban Developments won the contract, they subcontracted the entire land surveying work to an entity called Stonecrest Holdings, the Delaware shell company controlled by Dane and Georgia. And Stonecrest Holdings then hired Cross and Finch Associates' actual engineers as hourly consultants, paying them through a network of Delaware bank accounts. Dane and his partner, Arthur Finch, were rigging municipal bids. They were deliberately losing prime public contracts to Sylvia Ross's company, only to claw back the profits through Stonecrest, effectively hiding the revenue from their firm's tax returns, and from my divorce lawyers. But as I zoomed in on the Stonecrest consulting agreements, my eyes landed on a recurring monthly payment of $5,000 to an entity called MF Associates. I traced the corporate registration for MF Associates. The sole director was Madeline Finch. Maddie Finch, the woman who had just stood on my driveway, politely explaining why I wasn't invited to the neighborhood gala, was receiving $5,000 a month from the exact shell company used to hide my family's stolen assets. They weren't just excluding me. They were all on the payroll. I leaned back in my chair, the green light of the screen illuminating the dark room. A cold, quiet sensation of absolute clarity washed over me. They believed they had built an impenetrable wall of social and financial influence around themselves. They had no idea that the foundation of that wall was made of paper. And I held the matches. The water from the kitchen tap was a biting, liquid needles against my bare skin. I was washing the breakfast dishes by hand, using cold water to save on the electric bill for the hot water heater. Outside, The gray autumn sky pressed against the window panes, threatening the first frost of the season. The front door mail slot clattered. A thick manila envelope dropped onto the hardwood floor of the entryway with a heavy, final sound. I wiped my wet hands on my apron, retrieved the envelope, and slid my thumb under the heavy paper flap. It was from Sterling & Associates, the law firm representing Dane. It was a formal emergency motion for partition and sale of the marital residence. My eyes scanned the dense, sterile legal prose. Respondent Nora Cross is committing waste upon the marital asset by failing to maintain essential utility systems, specifically the primary heating unit, thereby placing the structure and plumbing at risk of catastrophic freeze damage. Attached to the motion was a digital exhibit, a copy of Mark's HVAC service ticket from the week before, with the notation, "Service declined by occupant due to inability to pay dispatch fee," highlighted in yellow. The psychological trap was breathtaking in its precision. Dane had canceled our family maintenance contract and blocked my access to our joint funds specifically to engineer a furnace failure. He didn't want to break my spirit. He wanted to create an official paper trail of my poverty, using it as legal proof of neglect to force the immediate sale of our home before the winter. Later that afternoon, Leo sat at the kitchen table, wearing a heavy St. Jude's Academy branded fleece jacket that Dane had bought him early. He dropped a gold-embossed card onto the counter. It was an invitation to the Cross family Thanksgiving dinner at the Oak Ridge Country Club. "Georgia gave me this when she picked me up from school," Leo said, his eyes fixed on his laptop screen as his virtual reality headset sat charging nearby. "She said I should RSVP for both of us, but when I looked at the guest list on the family portal, your name wasn't on it. Just Dad, me, Georgia, and Sylvia." "I see," I said, continuing to fold the dry laundry on the counter. Leo slammed his laptop shut, the plastic casing rattling against the oak wood. He turned to me, his face flushed with the hot, angry frustration of an 11-year-old who had been successfully taught to resent his own mother. "Why can't you just sign the papers, Mom?" he cried, his voice cracking with the emotional weight of a narrative he didn't fully understand. "Dad says if you just sign the settlement, we can all have a normal life. Sylvia invited us to her mountain cabin for Christmas, but Dad says we can't go because you're holding up the negotiations. Why do you have to make everything so hard? It's freezing in here, and you're just sitting in the dark like a martyr." The emotional distance between us was now a physical presence in the room, cold and heavy. Dane's wealth was a warm, bright paradise. My home was a dark, freezing cage. To Leo, my quiet survival wasn't a struggle. It was a personal attack on his happiness. "I'm sorry it's cold, Leo," I said, keeping my voice soft, entirely devoid of defensive anger. "I'm doing the best I can." "Well, your best is stupid," he snapped, grabbing his tech bag and running up the stairs, his door slamming with a violent, echoing thud that shook the plaster. I stood in the silent kitchen, my chest holding a dull, hollow ache. The manipulation was almost complete. They had turned my son against me, using his own comfort to sharpen their blades. At 10 o'clock, wrapped in a heavy wool blanket, I sat in my study. The small space heater clicked on the floor, its orange light reflecting off the dark walls. I opened my digital archiving portal and navigated into the financial records of the GC Legacy Trust, the trust Georgia controlled. I wanted to know exactly how Georgia was spending the money she had stolen from Leo's custodial fund 8 years ago. I traced a series of monthly transfers of $12,000 from the trust to an entity called Apex Structural Contractors. I pulled up the corporate registry for Apex. It had been registered 4 years ago. The physical address listed for Apex was a vacant gravel lot behind a warehouse owned by Cross and Finch Associates. The sole corporate officer of Apex was Georgia Cross, and the invoices submitted by Apex to the trust were for structural preservation and foundation stabilization on a luxury retirement villa in Palm Springs, California, a property Georgia had purchased 3 years ago. Dane's firm was writing off these fake construction invoices as corporate operating expenses, reducing their taxable business income to zero while funding Georgia's luxury retirement with our son's stolen inheritance. But as I zoomed in on the Apex Bank records, I found a digital copy of a check paid to a local family law mediator. The memo line of the check read, "Consulting fee, pre-separation asset strategy." The date on the check was June 14th, 18 months ago. My husband had been paying a family mediator to structure his assets and hide his wealth a full year before he ever packed his bags, long before I ever knew my marriage was in trouble. They had been planning my financial execution in the dark, using my son's money to pay for the shovel. I leaned back in my chair, looking out at the dark, freezing street. The wind rattled the loose window frame of my study. They believed they had planned the perfect crime, insulated by time and legal cleverness. They had no idea that an archivist's job is to find the one document that doesn't fit, and I had just found the check that would dismantle their entire timeline. The county family court smelled of wet wool, industrial floor wax, and the quiet, desperate tension of lives being legally dismantled. I sat at the defense table in courtroom 302, representing myself to conserve my meager freelance funds and to keep Dane's legal team off guard. Robert Sterling stood at the opposing lectern, looking immaculate in a tailored charcoal suit. In the front row of the gallery sat Georgia Cross, wearing her cream boucle coat, her hands folded in her lap with an expression of performative, motherly sorrow. "Your Honor," Sterling said, his voice smooth and carrying a practiced, rhythmic authority. "The respondent is actively committing waste upon the primary marital asset out of pure spite. We have submitted photographic evidence of the thermostat at 58 degrees, along with a certified service ticket from the HVAC technician stating that Mrs. Cross declined repairs. If this historic craftsman house is left without heat during the upcoming frost, the pipes are at risk of catastrophic freeze damage." Judge Richard Barrows, a tired-looking man with heavy gray eyes, turned to me. "Mrs. Cross, why hasn't the furnace been repaired?" "The primary corporate and joint accounts were terminated by my husband last week, Your Honor," I said, my voice quiet, level, and entirely devoid of emotion. "I am currently securing alternative funding for the repairs." Sterling offered a soft, patronizing smile. "Mrs. Cross has had ample time to address this. My client is simply trying to protect the home's equity for the sake of their son. We request an immediate court-ordered partition and sale of the property." Judge Barrows leaned forward, sighing. "I cannot allow a major marital asset to suffer structural damage, Mrs. Cross. I will grant the petitioner's motion to force an immediate sale of the property in exactly 10 days, unless the heating system is fully repaired and certified by a licensed contractor before then." "Thank you, Your Honor," Sterling said, offering a small, satisfied nod to Georgia in the gallery. The trap had closed, authorized by a judge who only saw the paper trail they had created. They had successfully leveraged my poverty to strip me of our home, leaving me with 10 days to find $400 I didn't have. On Thanksgiving Day, the silence of the Craftsman house was absolute. I sat at the kitchen table, wrapped in my mother's old knit blanket, eating a simple turkey breast I had prepared for myself. At noon, a sleek black town car pulled up to the curb. Leo came down the stairs, wearing his St. Jude's fleece jacket and carrying his fancy leather duffel bag. He didn't say, "Happy Thanksgiving." He didn't look at the small plate of food on the table. He simply walked out the front door, his sneakers squeaking on the cold hardwood floor. I watched from the kitchen window. Georgia sat in the back of the idling town car, her silver hair perfectly coiffed. Leo threw his bag into the trunk, climbed into the back seat, and closed the door. Georgia looked up at the dark, unlit windows of my house, offering a tiny, gloved wave of her hand before the car glided away toward the Oak Ridge Country Club. The psychological devastation was quiet and total. They had successfully made me invisible in my own family, rewriting my existence as a cold, restrictive obstacle to be avoided. My son was learning to look past me, matching his steps to their polished rhythm. That night, the temperature outside dropped below freezing. The wind howled through the loose shingles of the roof, the house groaning in the dark. I sat in my study, my fingers stiff as I typed on my laptop, the small space heater clicking on the floor. I opened my archiving portal and navigated into the foreign transaction history of the GC Legacy Trust. I wanted to know exactly how Georgia was routing the money she had stolen from Leo's custodial fund to Sylvia Ross's luxury condo. I traced a series of wire transfers from Georgia's fake shell company, Apex Structural Contractors, to a private bank account in Zurich, Switzerland, registered under the name Account 404 Helvetia. The co-signer on Account 404 Helvetia was Sylvia Ross. Georgia had been transferring Leo's stolen trust funds into this Swiss account, which then paid Sylvia Ross's private real estate firm in Seattle for consulting services. But the most devastating detail was a wire transfer of $80,000 from account 404 Helvetia to Sylvia's private family foundation on the exact day Leo was accepted into St. Jude's Academy. Sylvia Ross wasn't just a mistress. She was a business partner who was being paid by my mother-in-law, using my son's stolen inheritance to facilitate Leo's private school transfer and my social destruction. They had turned my child's education into a laundered business transaction. But as I scrolled to the very bottom of the Swiss ledger, my eyes caught a scheduled transaction. A final, massive wire transfer of $500,000 from account 404-Helvetia back into Stonecrest Holdings. The Delaware shell company controlled by Dane was scheduled for December 15th, the date of the final divorce settlement hearing. They were preparing to empty the Swiss account, bringing the stolen, laundered money back into Dane's domestic firm as new personal corporate capital, the moment I was legally forced out of their lives. I leaned back in my chair, my breath fogging slightly in the cold study. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed midnight, a low, solemn sound that echoed through the empty house. They had exactly 10 days before the court forced the sale of my home, and 3 weeks before they finalized the theft of my family's legacy. But they had forgotten one fundamental rule of archiving. Once a document is entered into the system, it belongs to the record. And the record was about to speak. The administrative offices of the County Historical Foundation were located in the basement of the old municipal library, a space smelling of dry paper, archival cardboard, and damp concrete. I sat across the desk from Dr. Raymond Cole, the foundation's director. He was a kind, quiet man with thick, wire-rimmed glasses who had authorized my freelance digitization contracts for 5 years. He wouldn't look me in the eye. He kept adjusting the papers on his desk, his fingers trembling slightly. "Nora," Dr. Cole said, his voice dropping into a low, strained whisper. "I'm so incredibly sorry. The advisory board had their quarterly budget meeting last night. Georgia Cross, well, she raised some concerns about your current capacity to handle the digitization of the 19th century probate ledgers. She suggested that given your personal situation, the Foundation should pause your contract to protect the integrity of the fragile documents. Georgia had struck again, her reach extending into the quiet corners of my professional life. She was systematically cutting off every trickle of income I had, ensuring I had no resources to fight the partition sale of my home. "I understand, Raymond," I said, offering him a gentle, reassuring smile. "Thank you for letting me know directly." "It's not right, Nora," Raymond whispered, looking up with genuine guilt. "You're the best archivist we've ever had, but Georgia's Family Foundation is our largest private donor." "I know," I said. "Don't worry about it." I walked out of the library into the freezing autumn drizzle. The dependency was now absolute. My primary source of survival had been severed. I drove downtown, parking my Volvo near Ward & Sons Fine Jewelers, a quiet, high-end estate jeweler located in the historic jewelry district. I sat in the front seat for a moment, looking at the small velvet box in my lap. Inside lay my late mother's pearl and diamond brooch. It was a delicate, mid-century piece, the only physical fragment of my family's history I had left besides my wedding ring. I walked into the shop, the air smelling of velvet and silver polish. Philip Ward, a quiet man with silver hair and a jeweler's loop resting against his cheek, inspected the brooch under his desk lamp. "It's a beautiful piece, Nora," Philip said, his voice gentle. "The pearls are natural and the diamond cuts are exceptional, but in this market, the best I can offer you for an immediate cash buyout is $600. The brooch was worth at least $2,000, but the court's 10-day deadline was ticking, and I had exactly 9 days left before Judge Barrows forced the sale of my home. "I'll take the $600, Philip," I said, keeping my voice steady. The psychological reality of that transaction was a special kind of humiliation. I was selling my mother's pearls to pay for a furnace repair that my millionaire husband had deliberately canceled to make me look negligent. But as I walked out of the shop with the cash in my purse, I didn't feel broken. I felt a cold, dangerous lightness. I was shedding their world, piece by piece, converting my sentimentality into fuel. 2 hours later, Mark's HVAC truck pulled into my driveway. He worked in the basement for an hour, the metallic clatter of his tools echoing through the floorboards. Finally, a low, deep rumble shook the house, followed by the warm, thick rush of air through the floor vents. The smell of burning dust and old oil filled the kitchen, the smell of survival. Mark came up the stairs, wiping his hands on a greasy rag, looking visibly relieved. "She's running, Nora," Mark said. "I replaced the thermocouple and cleaned the burners. The system is certified." "Thank you, Mark," I said, counting out the $400 in cash onto the counter. Mark took the money, his eyes darting to the floor. "Nora, look, I think you should know. Dane's assistant, Chloe Hayes, called our office 2 hours ago. She wanted to know if we had submitted the certified non-repair report to Robert Sterling's office yet. She seemed surprised when the office manager told her we were on our way here to do the repair." "I see," I said, offering him a quiet, satisfied smile. "Please ensure the certified repair receipt is filed with courtroom 302 immediately, Mark. I want Judge Barrows' clerk to have it before the end of the day." "I'll file it myself on my lunch break," Mark promised. After he left, I sat in my study, the warm air from the vent washing over my ankles. The house was finally quiet, the freezing chill defeated. I opened my laptop and scanned the synchronized corporate calendar of Cross and Finch Associates, a backup drive I had copied months ago. Because the Craftsman house address had once been linked to the corporate account, the HVAC invoice automatically triggered a notification on Dane's corporate expense dashboard. He would know within the hour that the furnace was fixed, and that his emergency motion for partition was dead. I looked closely at his calendar for the upcoming week. On next Monday morning at 9 o'clock, Dane had a private, off-the-calendar meeting scheduled at his office. The entry was marked with high priority red. Audit prep, Internal Revenue Service Compliance Office. The IRS wasn't auditing Cross and Finch Associates. They were auditing a specific subcontractor, Apex Structural Contractors, Georgia's fake construction company. Someone else had already flagged her fake invoices. I wasn't the only one watching them in the dark. But as I looked at the audit file numbers, I realized I was the only one who held the key to the vault they were trying to hide. The phone on my desk rang at precisely 9 o'clock on Friday morning. The caller ID displayed the name Sterling and Associates. I picked it up, keeping my breathing slow and even. Nora Cross? Nora. Robert Sterling's voice came through, smooth, professional, and thoroughly hollow. I wanted to reach out before the court clerk officially processed the HVAC certification. Obviously, my client is pleased that the heating system has been repaired and the marital asset is no longer at risk. We have filed a formal withdrawal of our emergency motion for partition. I see, I said, looking out the window at the frost-covered grass. However, Sterling continued, his tone shifting into that polite, patronizing register of a school principal lecturing a difficult student. Dane is concerned about where you obtained the $400 cash for the repair. If you are hiding personal assets from our financial discovery, that will complicate our negotiations. And of course, Dane's ability to finance Leo's transition to St. Jude's Academy next semester depends heavily on your cooperativeness. We'd hate to have to defer his enrollment because of unnecessary legal delays on your part. The threat was delivered with clinical precision. If I didn't play along, if I didn't sign the settlement that stripped me of my rights, they would use my son's education as the first casualty. The court has the certified repair receipt, Mr. Sterling, I said, my voice entirely flat. That is all that is required by Judge Barrow's order. Have a good day. I hung up before he could answer. At 6 o'clock that evening, the charcoal gray Audi pulled up to the curb. This time, however, Dane didn't stay in the car. He got out of the driver's seat, his jaw clenched, his wool coat unbuttoned. Leo ran up the porch steps, carrying his virtual reality headset in its fancy black case. He barely looked at me as he slipped past. Hey, Mom, the heat's back on. Yes, sweetie, I said, patting his arm. Go wash up for dinner. Dane walked up the steps, stopping on the top landing. He looked tense, his fingers twitching against the leather of his car keys. He tried to smile, that slick, corporate smile he used when he was pitching to the city council, but his eyes were dark, with a vibrating, suppressed fury. Nora, he said, his voice a low, harsh whisper. We need to talk. Where did you get the cash for that furnace? It's cold out here, Dane, I said, keeping my hands folded behind my back. Don't play games with me, he hissed, taking a step closer, his breath fogging in the freezing air. You think you're being clever, holding on to this house. But you can't afford the property taxes next month. You can't afford the maintenance. You're just delaying the inevitable out of pure spite. Sylvia is willing to be generous with the settlement, but my patience is wearing thin. If we go to trial on the 15th, I will ensure the court awards me sole custody of Leo based on your financial instability. The emotional escalation was brutal. He was threatening to take my child because I had fixed my own home, because I had refused to freeze in the dark. The psychological insight was clear. His anger was born of absolute fear. He had built a gilded, perfect empire with Sylvia Ross, but he was starting to realize that the foundation of that empire was entirely under my feet. He needed me to sign the waiver because he needed the paper trail of our marriage to be legally buried. "I'm doing what is necessary to maintain the house, Dane," I said softly, offering him a calm, unbothered smile. "Have a safe drive back to the city." His jaw clenched, a muscle twitching in his cheek. He turned and walked down the steps, his leather shoes clicking sharply on the concrete before he slammed the car door and sped away into the dark. I walked back into my warm study, locked the door, and opened my archiving portal. I navigated into the private federal compliance database, searching the case files for the upcoming audit of Apex Structural Contractors, Georgia's fake construction company. I wanted to know exactly why the IRS had flagged her account. According to the compliance logs, the audit had been triggered by a routine municipal scan of Ross Urban Development's Pine Ridge project. The investigator, Agent James Mercer, had flagged the $12,000 monthly payments from Georgia's trust to Apex, suspecting they were non-existent construction write-offs. But Agent Mercer was missing the final link. He had the fake invoices, and he had the trust withdrawals. But he didn't have the GC Legacy Trust's original bank signature cards showing Georgia's forgery. He didn't have the transaction ledgers showing that the money from those fake invoices was being routed directly to Sylvia Ross's Swiss account 404-Helvetia, to pay for Sylvia's Seattle condo and buy Leo's seat at St. Jude's. If I delivered those documents, the forged signature cards, the Swiss bank transfers, the Delaware shell registries, to Agent Mercer, the audit ceased to be a civil tax dispute. It became a federal criminal indictment for conspiracy, bank fraud, and money laundering. I looked at a draft email on Dane's corporate server that I had extracted earlier that afternoon. It was addressed to Robert Sterling, sent just yesterday. "Robert, we need to finalize the settlement with Nora before the December 15th hearing. If she gets her hands on the GC trust files before our meeting with the IRS investigator next Monday, we are completely exposed." They were terrified. They knew they had left a paper trail, but they believed they had hidden it deep enough in the Delaware and Swiss archives that a discarded housewife would never find it. I took a slow sip of my warm tea. The clock on the desk ticked in the quiet room. I opened a blank secure email draft addressed to Agent James Mercer at the Internal Revenue Service. I attached 3 files: the forged signature card, the Swiss wire ledgers, and the Delaware registration for Stonecrest Holdings. I hovered my mouse over the send button. I had exactly 3 days before Dane's Monday morning meeting with the investigator. The smell of cinnamon and melting butter filled the kitchen on Sunday morning, a warm, domestic fragrance that felt almost normal. I was making French toast, trying to recreate the quiet weekend routines that had once anchored our family. Leo sat at the kitchen island, his virtual reality headset resting on the stool next to him like a shiny plastic skull. He was tapping rapidly on his phone, his face bathed in the cold blue light of the screen. "Would you like some maple syrup, Leo?" I asked, sliding the plate of warm French toast toward him. "Sure," he muttered, not looking up. "Dad said we're going to look at some luxury condos near St. Jude's next weekend. He said I'll have my own bathroom and a balcony." The physical and emotional distance between us was a quiet, widening chasm. I couldn't fight Dane with money. I couldn't compete with the rooftop pools, the stadium boxes, or the designer clothes. He was systematically buying our son's loyalty, using his wealth to make my quiet survival look like a personal failure. "That sounds like a nice tour, Leo," I said, offering him a gentle, unbothered smile. He shrugged, took a single bite of the food, and went back to his phone. I watched him, my heart holding a dull, heavy ache. The manipulation was successful because it was invisible to him. He didn't see the theft. He only saw the shiny prizes. At 2 o'clock on Sunday afternoon, the doorbell rang. I opened the door to find Georgia Cross standing on the porch. She was wearing her cream boucle coat, but her face was pale, her eyes darting quickly to the warm air venting from the basement. She noticed the hum of the furnace immediately. Her pristine facade was slightly cracked, a thin line of tension visible around her mouth. "Nora, dear," she said, her voice dropping into that soft, manipulative register of fake kindness. "The house feels comfortable. I'm so glad you resolved the heating issue." "Hello, Georgia," I said, stepping aside to let her into the foyer. She walked into the kitchen and sat at the island, placing an expensive leather clutch on the granite counter. She looked at me, her eyes holding a frantic, vibrating energy that she was trying desperately to mask. "Nora," Georgia said, leaning forward and placing her hand over mine. Her skin was dry and cold despite her gloves. "We've been family for 12 years. I hate to see this bitterness between you and Dane. It's tearing Leo apart. I want to help you." "That's very generous of you, Georgia," I said, keeping my hands resting quietly in my lap. "I have a personal account," Georgia murmured, her voice dropping into a conspiratorial whisper. "Separate from the estate. I can wire you $10,000 today as a personal gift to help you transition into a lovely apartment. All I ask is that we wrap this up. We can sign the preliminary separation agreement this afternoon without the lawyers getting involved. It's just a formality, really. It would save everyone so much pain." The desperation was palpable. Georgia knew that Dane's meeting with the IRS compliance investigator, Agent James Mercer, was scheduled for 9 o'clock the next morning. If she could secure my signature on the separation agreement and the financial waiver this afternoon, her lawyers could argue in court that any subsequent financial disclosures or audits were motivated by personal malice rather than legal fact. She was trying to buy my silence before the federal clock started ticking. I looked at her diamond rings, the expensive clutch on my counter. "It's a very generous offer, Georgia," I said softly, offering her a calm, compliant smile. "But I prefer to let the court handle the disclosures on the 15th. I think it's best to keep everything transparent." Georgia's facade cracked completely. Her hand snapped back from mine, her face hardening into an expression of cold, sharp fury. "You are being remarkably foolish, Nora," she hissed, her voice dropping its soft, motherly register. "Dane is willing to be civil, but if you persist in this stubbornness, I will ensure you end up with nothing. Absolutely nothing. You won't even have the money to pay for Leo's groceries, let alone a lawyer." "I've learned to live with very little, Georgia," I said quietly, walking to the front door and opening it. "Have a safe drive back to the city." She stood up, her leather clutch tucked tightly under her arm, and walked out of the house without another word, her heels clicking sharply on the concrete steps. At 11:50 on Sunday night, the house was silent and warm. I sat in my study, the small space heater off, the radiator hum filling the room. On my monitor, the secure email draft to Agent James Mercer at the Internal Revenue Service was open. I checked the attachments one last time. The forged trust signature cards, the Swiss bank transfers for account 404 Helvetia, and the Stonecrest Holdings Delaware registry. I clicked send. The digital status bar blinked. Transmission successful. Delivered to recipient. I sat back in my chair, my heart beating in a steady, lethal rhythm. The match had been struck, and the fuel was already catching. But as I did a final routine scan of Cross and Finch Associates' private corporate server, my eyes caught a newly uploaded document in the firm's legal archive. The file was labeled restructure underscore draft underscore deck1.pdf. I opened it. It was a secret corporate resolution signed by Dane and Arthur Finch, dated just 2 days ago. On December 16th, the day after our scheduled divorce trial, they planned to file for Chapter 7 liquidation of Cross and Finch Associates. They would transfer all active municipal contracts and physical assets to a new entity, Ross and Finch Partners, leaving the original firm an empty, debt-ridden shell. And our Craftsman house, which had been leveraged for the firm's $50,000 HELOC, would be seized by the bank to pay off the liquidated corporate debts, leaving me homeless and completely destitute, despite any civil divorce judgment. They weren't just trying to starve me out. They were planning to burn the house down financially the moment the court doors closed. The downtown offices of Cross and Finch Associates were located on the top floor of a glass and steel tower, a space smelling of expensive leather, ozone, and corporate success. At 9 o'clock on Monday morning, I walked out of the elevator and into the reception lobby. Dane was standing near the glass conference room doors, his hand running through his hair, his face pale and tight. Beside him stood Robert Sterling, Sylvia Ross, and my mother-in-law, Georgia, who was clutching her designer handbag like a shield. They were gathered in a tense, hushed circle, whispering frantically over a tablet Sylvia was holding. When Dane looked up and saw me, his posture instantly stiffened, his eyes widening with a mixture of shock and sheer panic. "Nora?" he stammered, his corporate voice completely failing him. "What are you doing here? This is a private internal compliance audit.
You have no legal right to be on these premises."
"Actually, Dane, I do," I said, my voice quiet, steady, and carrying the calm authority of a woman who had spent weeks cataloging their ruin. Before he could answer, the double doors of the private elevator lobby swung open. 2 men in dark suits stepped out, carrying black leather briefcases. The older of the two, a sharp-featured man with cool gray eyes, walked straight toward our group. "Mr. Cross? Mrs. Cross?" the man said, flashing a gold shield from his breast pocket. "I am Agent James Mercer with the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. This is Assistant U.S. Attorney Richard Vance." Sylvia took a step back, her face draining of color. Georgia let out a small, choked gasp. "We are here to execute a federal asset freeze and seizure warrant," Agent Mercer said, his voice flat and completely clinical. "Pending an investigation into grand larceny, conspiracy, and federal bank fraud involving Stonecrest Holdings, Apex Structural Contractors, and Zurich Account 404 Helvetia." "This is a misunderstanding, Agent Mercer." Robert Sterling intervened quickly, his slick lawyer's smile completely vanished. "My client is preparing full civil disclosures. The disclosures are no longer civil, Mr. Sterling," Assistant U.S. Attorney Vance said, sliding a thick manila folder across the reception desk. "Last night, our office received the complete, verified transaction history of the GC Legacy Trust. We have the forged signature cards of Nora Cross, the digital IP routing records linking the fraudulent HELOC approvals to Dane Cross's personal phone, and the wire transfers of stolen trust funds to Sylvia Ross's private account in Switzerland." Dane stared at the folder, his chest rising and falling in shallow, rapid breaths. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a terrifying, hollow realization. "Nora, you couldn't have. You didn't even know."
An archivist's job is to preserve the record, Dane, I said softly, looking at his expensive leather shoes. And the record always speaks. Sylvia Ross stepped forward,
her jaw clenched, her polished corporate veneer completely shattered. "This is a personal domestic dispute," she hissed at Agent Mercer. "My company, Ross Urban Developments, is a primary municipal contractor. We have no part in this family's financial irregularities." "Actually, Sylvia, you do," I said, turning to face her with a gentle, polite smile. "Because at 8:30 this morning, the City Council held an emergency session. They have canceled your prime contract for the Pine Ridge redevelopment project." Sylvia blinked, her mouth opening slightly. "What?" "The Pine Ridge site contains the historic 1840s municipal township settlement," I explained, my voice echoing quietly in the pristine glass lobby. "For the past 2 weeks, during my freelance digitization work for the County Historical Foundation, I cataloged the original land grant deeds. I filed an emergency historic preservation easement with the state registry last Thursday." The room went completely, suffocatingly silent. "The entire Pine Ridge parcel has been legally classified as a protected heritage zone," I continued. "No commercial high-rises can be built there. Your development project is dead, Sylvia. And because your firm leveraged its municipal bond to finance the acquisition, you are officially in default of your contract with the city." Sylvia staggered back, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes fixed on the glass window overlooking the city she had attempted to buy. Her firm was bankrupt, her corporate influence erased by a single, century-old land deed she had ignored. I turned to Dane, who was staring at the floor, his hands trembling as he gripped his car keys. "And Dane," I said softly, "I saw the liquidation draft for Cross and Finch Associates. But because the court-appointed receiver has already frozen your firm's assets under the federal bank fraud warrant, your Chapter 7 bankruptcy is null and void. The bank cannot seize the Craftsman House. In fact, under the emergency marital asset preservation filing I submitted this morning, the family court has awarded me sole, unencumbered ownership of the house, funded entirely by the liquidation of your remaining corporate shares." Georgia sat down slowly on the lobby's leather sofa, her diamond rings clinking against her handbag. Her luxury retirement in Palm Springs dissolved before her eyes. I picked up my leather handbag and walked toward the elevators. I paused, looking back at my husband, his mother, and his mistress. 3 people standing in a high-rise tower that was about to disappear from beneath their feet. "Enjoy your meeting, Dane," I said quietly. I stepped into the elevator, the glass doors sliding shut with a soft, final click. When I drove my Volvo back into the driveway of my warm, quiet Craftsman house, the autumn sun was finally breaking through the gray clouds, casting a pale gold light across the oak trees. The front door opened. Leo stepped out onto the porch, wearing his old winter coat. He looked at the house, then at me as I climbed out of the car. The virtual reality headset was gone, left behind in his bedroom. He walked down the concrete steps, his shoulders dropping, his face soft with a quiet, vulnerable understanding. He had seen the news on his phone. He had seen the federal seals on his father's office doors. "Mom," he whispered, his voice shaking. "I'm sorry. I didn't know." I reached out, wrapping my arms around him, pulling his head against my chest. He held me tight, his fingers digging into my wool cardigan, the emotional distance between us completely evaporating in the cold morning air. "It's okay, Leo," I murmured, kissing the top of his head. "We're home." We walked inside, the heavy front door closing behind us, locking the quiet warmth of our survival in. I walked into the kitchen, turned on the kettle, and sat at the table. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked in a steady, peaceful rhythm, marking a history that was finally, completely our own.